Well, Gerald Celente is director of the Trends Research Institute. His team produces the TrendsJournal with hard-hitting, in-depth analysis of economic, sociopolitical, and cultural trends. Welcome back, Gerald Celente.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
I thought we could start off with your latest TrendsJournal edition. I have a copy here on the desktop. Geopolitical concerns, are high on the list. Give us an idea whether or not you think investors might be a bit complacent. Every equities sell-off we've seen has been met with surprising buying strength. Are investors overlooking the big picture here?
You know what's going on? If you follow the mainstream news, the business news, it's almost comical. Stocks are down because of geopolitical uncertainty. Stocks are up because of easing of geopolitical uncertainty. And it's just every day they keep up. Either they're overblowing it or they're downplaying it. But they're really not overblowing it at all because the world is teetering on war the way we see it. What's going on in Ukraine, this has been a propaganda effort by the United States, the likes of which I shouldn't say I've never seen in my lifetime, because after all, Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and ties to al-Qaeda. And I'm just reading President Obama's March 28, 2011 speech on why we have to overthrow the Gaddafi government. So propaganda has been going on there a long time. But what's going on in Ukraine is extremely important, because this is lining up to be Cold War 2.0. And why anybody would consider taking on the Russians is beyond my comprehension. I mean, after all, Napoleon couldn't pull it off. Hitler launched the largest, most massive military offensive in world history, and he couldn't pull it off against the Russians. Do you think the United States and NATO can, when they look what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan? Oh, and I mentioned Libya. That's up for grabs, too. So when I'm saying propaganda, I mean this without any hesitation at all. And I'm going to give you an examples. First of all, remember that airplane that was shot down over Ukraine? Have you seen any proof of who did it? Not a piece. Have you seen any proof of the Russians coming out, the Ukraine government's coming out and saying a Russian convoy came into Ukraine territory and we attacked it and we blew it up? Have you seen any photos of it? All they're doing is they're selling propaganda about the Russian troops on the borders, on and on and on, without showing one piece of evidence. Nothing. And what they're doing is they're putting out sound bites so the American public can find its enemy very easily, and the enemy has become Russia. Number two, what's going on in the Middle East, particularly with the Israel destruction of Gaza. And all of a sudden you can't say anything. I could save it for somebody else. Having said that, what's going on over there with the mass destruction is leading to war, because I have a fear that that's going to go into Lebanon. If that does, and then you go in what's going on into Syria, and that's up for grabs, and now you're seeing what's going on with the United States back engaged, by the way, into Iraq. You have a total destabilization of that area. Now, of course, what's going on in Ukraine, and that situation is only getting worse. So, going back to your initial question, are the people overlooking the geopolitical concerns that we are facing? And I believe, yes, they are, because this game could change overnight. It's so easy to take people to war. You have the TrendsJournal. I did a story in it about how easy it was for America to be led into the Afghan war. And I began it by saying words to the effect, it was Bush's speeches the evening of 9/11 and 9 days later in his address to the nation. And I began it by saying only a madman would speak these words, and only people struck with terror would believe them. And I broke apart his speech. Not one piece of evidence. Nothing that took us to war against Afghanistan, the longest war in American history. I'm saying that because, as you can see the propaganda being dealt out, you can see how little people really pay attention to the facts of the news rather than what's being fed through the government and through the media how easy it is to go to war. And when all else fails, they take you to war, and the global economy is failing. All you have to do is look at oil prices. The reason oil prices have been now they're down to 14-month lows, Brent crude. Why are they going so low? Because demand is so off. Look what the housing bubble that has burst in China. 67 out of 70 cities, housing prices are down. Housing prices are falling in London. The bubble is bursting everywhere, so to get your mind off things, a nice war really is a good diversion.
You really covered a lot of interesting bases there. Firstly, this idea, we saw Napoleon fail and many others. Russia, you might even say, is a nation that's never truly been defeated, although people point to the Cold War. But, we forget about their neighbors, China. The name itself, China, actually, as you know, it derives from the word wall. And the walls were there to keep out invading forces. When we look at this, you have two neighbors there that are the two undefeated countries of the world. And, they have quite a long history, too. Quite a substantial military in each country. So why would we even consider antagonizing both countries, neither of which we should be embracing them as allies? But yet we're doing the opposite. We forget how many folks who were defeated there. Let's start with Alexander the Great. He tried to get into Persia. He failed. Many folks would argue that the British Empire failed in Persia, bankrupted Russia. And now we have the hubris to march in there and think that we can accomplish the impossible, all while we're bankrupting this country. Tell us more.
Well, you really summed it up. And again, it's who are the we? The we aren't us. They happen to be in charge of the government. And I want to make the connections. When you talk about Ukraine, anybody could do this. They could go to YouTube, type in Victoria Nuland, N-U-L-A-N-D. And Victoria Nuland happens to be the Assistant Secretary of State. Her husband is Robert Kagan, one of the prime neocons. Put in December 13th, 2013. And there she is at the National Press Club. And you know who her sponsors are? Exxon and Chevron. Yeah, and here she is giving a speech about her trip to Ukraine. It's a third trip in 5 weeks. And she's going on and on and on about how the path of Ukraine is European. And that was going to require immediate steps to de-escalate the security situation and immediate political steps to end the crisis and get Ukraine back into a conversation with Europe and with the International Monetary Fund. Follow the money. And then I looked it up, and Chevron just cut a $10 billion deal to do hydrofracking in Ukraine. Oh, and I forgot this little side point. There's a energy company in Ukraine, the largest one, Burisma Energy, and they appointed someone to the board of directors. It's the largest energy company in Ukraine. Do you know who it is? Joseph Biden's son, Hunter Biden. And they also appointed, another fellow who is Christopher Hines of the Hines Fortune, and John Kerry's stepson, Devon Archer, his partner, Christopher Hines' business partner, Devon Archer, was also appointed to Burisma Energy. I mean, who are these people kidding?
You have the West that wants to embrace Ukraine for its natural resources. And, of course, Russia does not want to let go of its key resource regarding energy, all different types of energy, as well as the breadbasket, I'm sure you'd agree, of Eurasia. Essentially, you have the West saying, they need to be free so our companies can exploit the nation. And you have Russia that's a former Soviet bloc country. This is a strategic resource for us.
It would be like if we had problems with Mexico or Canada and Russia coming in here and telling us what we should do. Here, I want to read this to you. A new deal with the IMF would also send a positive signal to private markets. This is Victoria Nuland at the National Press Club on December 13, 2013, and would increase foreign direct investment that is so urgently needed in Ukraine. Hey, what are you doing talking about they need? You're supposed to be working for us. But I digress. Signing the association agreement with the EU would also put Ukraine on a path to strengthening that sort of stable, quote, and predictable business environment that investors require. There is no other path that would bring Ukraine back to long-term stability and economic growth. And it's the United States, and she's also on audio tape with the Ukraine ambassador, American ambassador to the Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, planning the overthrow of the Yanukovych government.
If they pull us into a global conflict here, which I suspect the stage is being set.
It is being set. Chris, you're a student of history. We are now 100 years away from the First World War. The war to end all wars, the so-called Great War, a war that by every historian's knowledge was totally avoidable, and it destroyed Europe. Europe never regained from it. It was blossoming in truly a new age.
Exactly, and it set the stage, as John Maynard Keynes pointed out in his treatise, for the next most even more horrible war. And it almost feels like a purge. If people could step back from their daily lives and imagine that they were born into privilege, never had to work a job in their lives, the rest of us would look like sheep. We're just sheeple. Heaven forbid if some of those sheep start to look like wool. We've got to clear the herd a little bit. And nothing clears better and makes profits for the elite better than wars. They profit on both sides of the conflict, don't they?
But this is different. This is the war that when they asked Albert Einstein, how will the Third World War be fought?
I don't know, but the next one will be with sticks and stones.
You got it. Yeah, no. That's it. This is a war of weapons of mass destruction. You know how they always say generals fight the last war? This is different. This isn't going to be tanks and planes. It'll be high-speed missiles and biological warfare and nuclear. And that's why at all costs we need to avoid war. And as I mentioned, it's so easy to go into it.
And this is coming from a martial arts practitioner.
No, I'm not a pacifist at all. I'm a close combat practitioner. And I had my own school for many years. But I believe in self-defense. I don't believe in attacking a country that's not a threat. I will attack the attacker.
I try to tell this to friends and family, and don't you remember why the world looked up to the United States? It wasn't just that it wasn't just the Statue of Liberty motto. It was the fact that we were that type of a country. We were there trying to police things and keep the status quo. Another interesting thing here in the Trends Journal, and this maybe isn't something that all of our audience will be keen to hear, but I think it's really important for every stage of life, and that's our health. And you've always brought up this topic, and it's one I think that everyone could use, even physicians can use help with sometimes. What I wanted to talk about was this idea about you're delving into the stats on what we're eating and the salt, sugar, additives, and it's just not necessary. I mean, you don't have to be independently wealthy to eat a healthy diet. Please tell us more.
Again, what we did with this Trends Journal, the feature story, was don't blame Obamacare, blame I don't care. And, we do have the most expensive healthcare system in the world. And it could be even more expensive. It's not going to make any difference as long as people keep eating what they eat and keep doing what they do. We're the most obese nation in the world. I mean, I never remember as a kid seeing people ride down supermarket aisles in cars, little electric cars, because they're too obese to walk. I mean, that's a phenomenon that we've never seen. Type 2 diabetes didn't exist when I was a kid, and now how many children have it?
It's diabesity. My very favorite physician, Dr. Mark Hyman, he says half of us are either diabetic or we are pre-diabetic or we're on the road to diabetes. And it doesn't have to be the case. And, I've just seen miracle after miracle where folks have simply cut the sugar out of their diet. Condiments, mostly filled with sugar. Little things like tomato sauces. We can make a difference without having to turn to insulin-related medicines that cause a lot of trouble in people's lives. Tell us more.
Hit on a lot of it because you keep taking it further. And it's with the people, they don't care what they look like, and they don't care how they dress. Again, when I remember as a young guy flying, people got, dressed when they got on an airplane. Now it's a flying circus.
Yeah, yep.
And then when I remember as a young guy in business going into a restaurant without a jacket, and they wouldn't let me in. Conversations going on 4 tables away. You hear people screaming. So what I'm saying is it's a decline in many different ways. So people ask me, well, how could things change? And to me, the way they're going to change is when people find the courage, the dignity, the self-respect, the integrity, and the passion to be the best that they can be. And then when you get to those levels, or you feel you keep working, it's a never-ending life experience, you keep trying to get better at everything that you do, that's when things change, because you don't accept whether it's low-quality food, low-quality relationships, or low-quality politicians. It's all connected. And right now, we are at the lowest common denominator. Look at the numbers when the American people, look how they look at Congress and the presidency. There's a total lack of, a huge lack of respect. And then you listen to their language of the politicians.
And, before we change topics here, I'd like to add that what Dr. Mark is always pointing to is that this is really an inflammation battle. Type 2 diabetes, as you brought up, and so many other diseases. And, he worked in an emergency room, and he said, for many years, and he said, the one thing we really have right in the medical community is if you're in an accident and you've had trauma, or you're having a cardiac arrest, or, something along these lines, the emergency room, wow, do we have that right? We will fix you up, and more than likely you'll be on your merry way, and we can rehabilitate you. But where we've got it wrong is chronic illness, because what we don't realize is I'm a man of 45 years. It took me 45 years to get into the shape I'm in right now. I'm not going to clean that mess up in 4 or 5 weeks, or even 4 or 5 months. It might take 4 or 5 years of lifestyle change. And that might be cutting out the fast food, the fries, the milkshakes, the tomato sauces, go back to organic sauces, things of this nature. But you can reduce the inflammation, which is at the root of almost all chronic disease, by simply getting the sugar out of your diet.
The first book I worked on was Natural Healing back in the mid-1980s. I have an honorary doctorate degree in integrative medicine from the National University of Health Sciences. So I've been on this for a lot of years. My former wife was literally dying from colitis. You're talking about chronic degenerative diseases. And they were going to remove her colon, a big chunk of it, and other things that aren't very nice to talk about on the radio. And I went on the crusade. This is in the late 70s, when people weren't talking about this stuff, to try to save her life. And I did. And we found in those days with chiropractors, they were way ahead of the curve. And that's how I worked on natural healing. She got totally healed. And they had her on prednisone and all these other drugs. And all they do is stop the symptoms. There's no allotropic drug on the market that cures a chronic degenerative disease, period, paragraph. And so that's why I'm very much into this, and I try to live it as well. So everything I buy, I don't buy corporate food. I stay away from it as much as I can, I should say. I rarely go into a so-called supermarket. I try to buy everything I can organic, and like you said, it's not real. Yes, organic does cost more, but even if you're not buying organic and you're eating healthy, you can eat. If you're buying burgers at McDonald's and you're drinking soda, you could afford the same alternatives for a healthy food. And again, I stopped drinking soda, and now I'm in my late 60s.
You can take small steps. No one expects you to change everything overnight. For instance, as you say, cut out the fast food, start cooking at home. And that is, we have to take our health into our own hands and stop looking for that magic pill. Because, as I mentioned before, it takes decades to get into this shape, and it can take years to pull yourself out, but it's doable, and it doesn't come from an insulin injection. All that's going to do is increase your insulin resistance over the long term and lower your quality of living.
See, it all ties in, because what you just said is it takes time and it takes work. And you keep taking that concept and you bring it into economics and social as well.
Excellent, yes.
So it's all tied together. discipline, and there's nobody on a white horse to save the day. You're it, and it's not politician, so don't look for the answers with them. Look for the answers within yourself.
I read an interesting article this week at one of my favorite web blogs, and it was from an author who was just disgusted with what he was seeing in the workplace. And he said, I hire many folks, but I wanted to write this article to tell you how, I had nothing, like everyone of my generation. He said, this isn't a story of how, I'm a great guy who pulled myself up. A few decades ago, we all worked odd jobs. I mean, I could name 100 jobs I've had, and so could you. And he said, but today, people are just sitting on the couch expecting, this to come and that to come. And while you're waiting for all that success, you simply had to wait tables, push grocery carts. This is the reality of life. As we wrap up today, Gerald Celente, any other closing topics?
Well, the thing on the economy, there's no question about it. Again, when you look at oil prices, decline there under, and when you look at property prices around the world dropping, and the reality of interest rates going up. When interest rates go up, the economy goes down. We're forecasting, and that's what's going to happen. They're going to have to raise interest rates. However, having said that, when the economy starts going down, when interest rates start going up, they're going to come up with a new scheme to juice the economy with more fake money. And when they do that, that's when you're going to see gold prices take off.
History is our guide here. Everyone thinks that precious metals rally is over for good, but think about it. Back in the 70s, things didn't really take off for the precious metals until inflation was more evident. And that's when the Fed was forced to ratchet up rates to levels never seen before in the United States.
That's right. People forgot that.
So people are thinking, well, the Fed can just raise rates. Well, they forget at what cost. What was the cost? How about the 1980s was one of the tougher work environment and employment situations for quite some time? Who's going to have the courage to do that now? We don't have the political wherewithal to say, hey, you know what? We're going to have to fight inflation, folks. So instead of increasing your limits on your debit cards, your EBT cards, what we're going to do is we're going to take most of your jobs away by ratcheting rates up so high that businesses close up shop. Nobody's going to do it.
And not only that, you're looking at private mergers and acquisition activity now is at the highest level it's been since 2007. And the only reason that's happening is because of all the cheap money they're getting.
The banks are sitting on an enormous amount of money, and they have nothing to do except toss it at things like stocks or buy their own shares back. So it's well said. All right, Gerald Celente, we want to thank you for your time today, and I'd like to give you a chance to tell people more about the Trends Journal and any other projects you're working on.
Yeah, the Trends Journal. Matter of fact, just today we launched the Trends Monthly. So besides the quarterly, we're putting out a monthly. We, of course, every evening, weekday evening, we do Trends in the News, about a 20-minute news show. And we're having another conference in mid-October, History Before It Happens conference. We just had one in August 1st, and we had people from all over the world, from Japan, from Australia, from Switzerland, as far away as from Honolulu, Alaska, to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to New York City. So we're really doing a lot. We're having the meetings here in Colonial Kingston, New York, at the 1774 Academy. Couldn't be more appropriate. So we're doing a lot here at the Trends Journal.
Sounds great.